The morning sun cast its golden rays across the sprawling estate of Ravenshire Manor, where the aristocratic Pemberton family had resided for generations. The Georgian mansion stood majestically against the backdrop of perfectly manicured gardens, its limestone facade adorned with elaborate columns and intricate stonework that spoke of wealth accumulated over centuries. Inside the grand foyer, servants moved with practiced efficiency, their footsteps echoing against marble floors as they prepared for what was to be the social event of the season. Lady Charlotte Pemberton stood before the towering window of her private chambers, her reflection caught in the morning light that streamed through diamond-paned glass. At 22, she possessed the refined beauty that was expected of young women of her station, auburn hair arranged in the fashionable Grecian style, green eyes that sparkled with intelligence, and a complexion that had been carefully protected from the harsh realities of common life. Her morning dress, crafted from the finest silk in soft lavender, was adorned with delicate pearl buttons and Brussels lace that had cost more than most families earned in a year. Yet despite her privileged circumstances, Charlotte's expression held a shadow of uncertainty that seemed at odds with the celebration that awaited her. Tomorrow, she would marry Lord Edmund Blackthorne, the second son of the Duke of Westmere, in a ceremony that would unite two of England's most powerful families. The match had been arranged with meticulous care by her father, the Earl of Ravenshire, who saw in this alliance the perfect opportunity to strengthen both their social position and financial security. The elaborate preparations for the wedding had consumed the household for months. Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, had supervised the transformation of the estate's chapel into a vision of white roses and trailing ivy. The kitchens bustled with activity as cook directed the preparation of an elaborate wedding feast that would satisfy the refined palates of nearly 300 guests. Every detail had been planned with the precision of a military campaign, from the French champagne that would flow like water to the orchestra that had been imported from Vienna specifically for the celebration. Charlotte's lady's maid, Sarah, entered the chamber carrying a silver tray laden with correspondence that had arrived with the morning post. The young woman's face bore the rosy complexion of someone who had spent her life in service, yet her eyes held a warmth and loyalty that transcended the boundaries of social class. She had served Charlotte since childhood, and their relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship, though neither would dare acknowledge such familiarity openly. "Your ladyship, Lord Blackthorne's valet delivered this personally," Sarah announced, presenting a cream-colored envelope sealed with the distinctive Blackthorne family crest in deep blue wax. The sight of Edmund's handwriting caused Charlotte's heart to flutter with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that had become increasingly familiar as their wedding day approached. Edmund Blackthorne was considered one of London's most eligible bachelors, despite being a second son. At 28, he possessed the dark handsomeness that was fashionable among the ton, with piercing blue eyes and an athletic build that spoke of his passion for fencing and horseback riding. His education at Eton and Oxford had polished his already considerable charm, making him equally comfortable discussing politics with parliament members or poetry with literary enthusiasts. Most importantly, his inheritance, though not as substantial as his elder brother's, was more than sufficient to maintain Charlotte in the style to which she had become accustomed. Yet as Charlotte broke the wax seal and unfolded Edmund's letter, she found herself searching not for declarations of passion, but for some hint of the genuine affection that she desperately hoped existed beneath the formal courtesy that characterized their courtship. Their engagement had been announced with great fanfare at a ball hosted by the Duke of Westmere, where Charlotte had worn a gown of pale blue silk that had been specifically chosen to complement the sapphires that Edmund had presented to her as an engagement gift. The courtship itself had followed the prescribed patterns of their social class with mathematical precision. Edmund had called upon Charlotte twice weekly, always in the presence of her mother or an appropriate chaperone. They had taken carefully supervised walks in Hyde Park, attended the opera in the company of both families, and engaged in the sort of polite conversation that revealed little of their true thoughts or feelings. Charlotte found Edmund to be an agreeable companion, well-educated, and possessed of impeccable manners, yet she could not shake the feeling that she was looking at a perfectly crafted mask rather than glimpsing the man beneath. The letter in her hands contained the sort of sentiment that she had come to expect from Edmund, proper, affectionate in the restrained manner that was considered appropriate, and utterly lacking in the passionate declarations that populated the romantic novels she read in secret. He wrote of his anticipation for their union, his respect for her character, and his determination to be a worthy husband. These were the words of a gentleman fulfilling his obligations, not those of a man consumed by love. As Charlotte folded the letter and placed it carefully in her jewelry box alongside the others she had received from Edmund, she caught sight of her reflection in the ornate mirror that dominated one wall of her chamber. The young woman who stared back at her appeared every inch the perfect bride-to-be, yet Charlotte could see the questions that lurked in her own eyes. Was it unreasonable to hope for more than mutual respect and social compatibility in marriage? The romantic novels that she devoured suggested that such feelings existed, yet the practical wisdom of her upbringing insisted that affection could grow over time between two well-suited individuals. Her mother, Lady Margaret Pemberton, chose that moment to enter the chamber, her presence announced by the subtle rustle of silk skirts and the faint scent of the French perfume that she favored. At 45, Lady Margaret retained much of the beauty that had made her one of the most sought-after débutantes of her generation, though the years had added a calculating quality to her gaze that spoke of hard-won wisdom about the realities of social position. "Charlotte, my dear, you must come downstairs immediately," Lady Margaret announced, her voice carrying the tone of barely controlled excitement that had characterized her demeanor since the engagement had been finalized. "The florist has arrived with the most exquisite arrangements, and the seamstress is here for the final fitting of your wedding gown. We simply cannot afford any delays with so many details yet to be confirmed." The wedding gown in question was a masterpiece of the dressmaker's art, crafted from ivory silk and adorned with seed pearls that had been sewn individually by hand. The design followed the fashionable empire silhouette, with a high waist that flattered Charlotte's figure and sleeves that terminated in points of delicate lace. The train, which would extend several feet behind Charlotte as she walked down the aisle, was embroidered with tiny silver threads that created the illusion of morning dewdrops on rose petals. As Charlotte descended the grand staircase toward the morning room where the final preparations awaited her, she passed portraits of generations of Pemberton ancestors who gazed down at her with expressions of aristocratic confidence. These were men and women who had navigated the complexities of high society with apparent ease, making advantageous marriages and accumulating both wealth and influence through careful strategic planning. Their presence seemed to remind Charlotte that her own marriage was merely the latest chapter in a continuing story of family advancement. The morning room itself had been transformed into a command center for wedding preparations, with fabrics, flowers, and various items of correspondence spread across every available surface. Mrs. Whitmore consulted frequently with a leather-bound notebook that contained detailed schedules for every aspect of the celebration, while the florist created elaborate centerpieces that would grace the tables at tomorrow's wedding breakfast. Charlotte submitted to the ministrations of the seamstress with the practiced patience that had been instilled in her since childhood. As the woman made minute adjustments to the gown's fit, pinning here and tucking there, Charlotte's thoughts drifted to the ceremony that awaited her. The chapel at Ravenshire Manor would be filled with the cream of London society, all gathered to witness her transformation from Lady Charlotte Pemberton into Mrs. Edmund Blackthorne. The Archbishop himself would perform the ceremony, lending additional gravitas to an occasion that was already being discussed in drawing rooms throughout the capital. Yet despite the magnificence of the preparations and the importance of the social connections that would be strengthened by this union, Charlotte could not shake a growing sense of unease that seemed to settle more heavily upon her shoulders with each passing hour. Perhaps it was merely the natural nervousness of any bride-to-be, she told herself, or the weight of expectations that accompanied such a significant step. But as she stood motionless while the seamstress worked, Charlotte found herself wondering if she would look back on this day with joy or regret. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the arrival of yet another visitor to the estate, and Charlotte glanced toward the window to see Edmund's familiar black carriage drawing up before the main entrance. Her heart quickened slightly at the sight, though whether from anticipation or anxiety, she could not say. Edmund emerged from the carriage with his characteristic grace, adjusting his perfectly fitted morning coat before striding toward the entrance with the confident bearing of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. Edmund Blackthorne's arrival at Ravenshire Manor was met with the sort of formal welcome that befitted his position as the future son-in-law of the Earl. The butler, Henderson, a dignified man whose family had served the Pembertons for 3 generations, greeted Edmund with the precisely calibrated deference that his station demanded. The footmen who attended to his hat and gloves moved with the silent efficiency that characterized well-trained household staff, their livery immaculate despite the bustling activity that surrounded the wedding preparations. Yet beneath Edmund's composed exterior, a storm of conflicting emotions raged with increasing intensity. As he was escorted through the familiar corridors toward the drawing room where Charlotte and her family awaited him, Edmund found himself studying the oil paintings and elaborate furnishings with the attention of someone seeing them for the last time. The Persian carpets beneath his feet, the crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across cream-colored walls, the delicate porcelain figurines that graced mahogany side tables, all of it seemed to take on a heightened significance that left him feeling strangely detached from his surroundings. The drawing room itself was a testament to the Pemberton family's refined taste and considerable wealth. Walls covered in silk damask in soft gold tones provided the perfect backdrop for furniture that had been crafted by London's finest artisans. French windows opened onto the estate's formal gardens, where ancient oak trees provided shade for meandering pathways lined with precisely trimmed hedgerows. It was within this sanctuary of privilege and elegance that Edmund had spent countless hours during his courtship of Charlotte, engaging in the careful dance of conversation and social interaction that their respective positions demanded. Charlotte rose to greet him as he entered, her movements displaying the perfect posture and grace that had been instilled in her through years of instruction from dancing masters and deportment teachers. Today she wore a morning dress of pale yellow muslin that brought out the golden highlights in her auburn hair, and her smile held the gentle warmth that had initially attracted Edmund's notice when they had been introduced at a soirée hosted by mutual friends. "Edmund, how wonderful to see you," Charlotte said, extending her hand in the manner that protocol required. "I trust your preparations for tomorrow are proceeding smoothly." Edmund took her hand and bowed slightly, pressing his lips briefly to her gloved knuckles in a gesture that had become routine between them. Yet today, the simple contact seemed to carry additional weight, and he found himself holding her gaze longer than was strictly necessary. In Charlotte's green eyes, he saw a reflection of his own uncertainty, though whether she was questioning their upcoming union or simply experiencing the natural nervousness of any bride, he could not determine. "Indeed they are, my dear Charlotte," Edmund replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil that churned within him. "My valet has ensured that every detail of my attire is in perfect order, and I have received confirmation that my groomsmen will arrive tomorrow morning precisely as scheduled." Lady Margaret, who had been observing their interaction with the keen attention of a general surveying a battlefield, stepped forward to join the conversation. Her own preparations for the wedding had taken on the characteristics of a military campaign, with detailed schedules, backup plans for every conceivable contingency, and a network of servants and suppliers who had been organized with clockwork precision. "How splendid, Edmund," Lady Margaret said, her smile radiating the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning was coming to fruition. "I have just received word that the Duke and Duchess of Westmere will arrive this evening for dinner, along with your brother Charles and his wife. It will be such a pleasure to have the families united under our roof before tomorrow's ceremony." The mention of his family caused Edmund's jaw to tighten almost imperceptibly, though years of training in the social graces allowed him to maintain his composed expression. His relationship with his elder brother Charles had always been complicated by the realities of primogeniture and their father's obvious preference for his heir. Charles would inherit not only the dukedom but also the vast majority of the family's wealth and property, leaving Edmund to make his own way in the world with the smaller inheritance that was customary for second sons. This financial reality had been a significant factor in Edmund's decision to pursue Charlotte Pemberton as a bride. Her substantial dowry and the commercial interests that came with an alliance to the Earl of Ravenshire would provide Edmund with the financial security necessary to maintain his position in society. It was a practical arrangement that made perfect sense from every perspective except, perhaps, that of the heart. "Your father has been most generous in his arrangements for the ceremony," Lady Margaret continued, seemingly oblivious to the subtle tension that had entered Edmund's demeanor. "The Duke's donation to the chapel fund will allow for the installation of that beautiful new stained glass window that we discussed. It will serve as a lasting memorial to this joyous union." Edmund nodded appropriately and made the expected responses to Lady Margaret's commentary about the wedding arrangements, but his attention was increasingly drawn to Charlotte herself. She participated in the conversation with the skilled politeness that her upbringing demanded, yet Edmund sensed something different about her today. Perhaps it was the way her gaze occasionally drifted toward the windows that overlooked the gardens, or the manner in which her fingers worried the fabric of her skirt when she thought no one was observing her. The Earl of Ravenshire entered the drawing room at that moment, his presence immediately commanding attention despite his relatively modest physical stature. Lord Henry Pemberton had built his reputation on shrewd business acumen rather than inherited privilege, having transformed the family's modest holdings into a commercial empire that spanned shipping, textiles, and banking. His marriage to Lady Margaret had been as carefully calculated as any of his business ventures, combining her aristocratic connections with his growing wealth to create a formidable social and economic force. "Edmund, my boy," the Earl said, extending his hand with the hearty warmth of a man who was genuinely pleased with the match he had orchestrated. "How are you feeling on this momentous day? Tomorrow you will officially become part of our family, and I could not be more delighted with the arrangement." The Earl's obvious satisfaction with the upcoming marriage served only to intensify Edmund's growing sense of unease. There was no question that he was making an advantageous match from every practical perspective, yet the closer they came to the actual ceremony, the more he found himself questioning whether practical considerations should be the sole foundation for a lifetime commitment. As the conversation continued around topics related to the wedding preparations and the various guests who would be attending, Edmund found his attention wandering to memories of another young woman whose image had haunted his thoughts with increasing frequency as his wedding day approached. Rebecca Fairfax was the daughter of his father's estate manager, a position that placed her family in that ambiguous social territory between the servant class and the gentry. She possessed neither the wealth nor the connections that would make her an appropriate bride for someone of Edmund's station, yet she had captured his imagination in a way that no properly eligible young lady had ever managed to achieve. Rebecca's beauty was of an entirely different character than Charlotte's refined elegance. Where Charlotte possessed the pale, protected complexion that was prized among the aristocracy, Rebecca's skin held a golden tone that spoke of time spent outdoors. Her dark hair refused to conform to the elaborate styles that fashion demanded, instead falling in natural waves that caught the light with each movement. Most significantly, her conversation sparkled with a wit and intelligence that had never been constrained by the rigid rules of social propriety that governed interactions among the ton. Edmund had encountered Rebecca during his visits to his father's country estate, where she often accompanied her father on his rounds of the property. Their conversations had begun innocently enough, focusing on topics such as estate management and agricultural improvements. Yet gradually, these exchanges had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than any interaction Edmund had ever experienced within the carefully regulated environment of high society. With Rebecca, Edmund found himself able to express thoughts and opinions that he would never dare voice in more formal company. She challenged his assumptions about social class and privilege in ways that were both unsettling and exhilarating. Most importantly, when he was with Rebecca, Edmund felt that he was encountering his authentic self rather than the carefully constructed persona that his position in society required him to maintain. The sound of his name being spoken drew Edmund back to the present conversation, where Lady Margaret was discussing the schedule for the following day's events. He realized that he had been expected to respond to some question about his preferences for the wedding breakfast, and he quickly offered an appropriate reply while struggling to refocus his attention on the immediate situation. "I apologize," Edmund said, offering Charlotte a smile that he hoped appeared more genuine than it felt. "I'm afraid my mind was occupied with some last-minute business matters that require attention before tomorrow. You know how these things can preoccupy a gentleman's thoughts." Charlotte's expression showed a flash of something that might have been disappointment, though it was quickly replaced by understanding acceptance. "Of course, Edmund. I'm sure there are many details that demand your attention at such a time." Yet even as Charlotte spoke these understanding words, Edmund detected a note of something that sounded almost like relief in her voice. Perhaps she, too, was struggling with doubts about their impending union. The realization that Charlotte might be experiencing her own uncertainties about their marriage struck Edmund with unexpected force, causing him to study her face more intently than social convention typically allowed. For a moment, their eyes met across the elegant drawing room, and Edmund thought he glimpsed a kindred spirit struggling with the same questions that tormented him. Were they both simply fulfilling the expectations that their families and society had placed upon them, or was there genuine potential for happiness in the union they were about to make? The question hung between them, unspoken but somehow palpable in the charged atmosphere of the room. The arrival of tea provided a welcome distraction from the intensity of the moment, as Lady Margaret assumed her role as hostess with the practiced ease that came from years of social entertaining. The ritual of afternoon tea, with its delicate china cups and elaborate silver service, represented everything that Edmund both valued and questioned about his world. The beauty and refinement of the ceremony were undeniable, yet he found himself wondering whether such elaborate formalities truly enhanced human connection or simply provided a barrier against authentic communication. As the afternoon progressed and Edmund prepared to take his leave, he found himself studying every detail of the scene before him as if he were memorizing it for posterity. Charlotte's graceful movements as she poured tea, Lady Margaret's animated discussion of tomorrow's guest list, the Earl's satisfied expression as he contemplated the successful conclusion of months of careful planning, all of it seemed to take on a dreamlike quality that left Edmund feeling like an observer rather than a participant in his own life. When the time came for Edmund to depart, he kissed Charlotte's hand with the same formal courtesy that had characterized their entire courtship, yet this time he found himself wondering if it might be the last time he would perform this gesture as her intended husband. The thought struck him with such unexpected force that he nearly stumbled as he stepped back, though he quickly recovered his composure and offered the appropriate farewells to the assembled family members. As Edmund's carriage pulled away from Ravenshire Manor, he turned to look back at the imposing structure that would soon become his second home through marriage. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the estate's grounds, creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed to mirror the conflicting emotions that raged within his heart. Tomorrow, he would stand before God and society and pledge his life to Charlotte Pemberton, yet with each passing hour, that prospect seemed to fill him with increasing dread rather than anticipation. The clock in Edmund's private study had just struck 7 when his valet, Thompson, knocked discreetly upon the mahogany door that separated his master's sanctuary from the bustling household beyond. Thompson had served the Blackthorne family for nearly 2 decades, beginning his career as an underservant before gradually ascending to his current position of trust and responsibility. His loyalty to Edmund was absolute, yet even he could not fail to notice the increasing agitation that had characterized his master's demeanor as the wedding day approached. "My lord," Thompson announced in the carefully modulated tones that his position required, "your evening attire has been prepared, and your father has requested your presence in the library at your earliest convenience." Edmund looked up from the letter he had been attempting to write for the better part of an hour, his normally fluid handwriting marred by false starts and crossed-out phrases that betrayed his internal turmoil. The letter was intended for Rebecca Fairfax, though what exactly he hoped to communicate to her remained unclear even to himself. Was he seeking to bid her a final farewell before his marriage made such correspondence impossible? Was he hoping for some word of encouragement that might ease his troubled conscience? Or was he, perhaps, contemplating something far more dramatic and potentially destructive? "Thank you, Thompson," Edmund replied, setting down his pen with a sense of relief that surprised him. "Please inform His Grace that I will join him presently." As Thompson departed to carry out his instructions, Edmund rose from his desk and moved to the window that overlooked the gardens of Blackthorne House. The London residence of the Duke of Westmere was a testament to generations of accumulated wealth and power, its imposing facade designed to intimidate as much as to impress. The gardens, while beautiful, were formal and constrained, each hedge and flower bed positioned according to rigid geometric principles that left no room for the wild growth that characterized the countryside estates Edmund preferred. The summons to meet with his father filled Edmund with a familiar mixture of duty and resentment that had characterized their relationship since childhood. The Duke of Westmere was a man who had never questioned the rightness of his position in the world or the obligations that came with noble birth. He had married Edmund's mother because she brought the appropriate connections and dowry to their union, had produced the required heir and spare, and had conducted his life according to the principles that had governed aristocratic behavior for centuries. The library of Blackthorne House was perhaps Edmund's favorite room in the vast mansion, its floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture. Here, surrounded by the works of classical authors and contemporary philosophers, Edmund had spent countless hours during his youth, seeking answers to questions that seemed to have no place in the practical world of aristocratic responsibility. His father stood before the marble fireplace, a snifter of brandy in his hand and an expression of satisfaction on his weathered features. At 58, the Duke remained an imposing figure, his silver hair and dignified bearing commanding respect in any gathering. He had built his reputation on unwavering adherence to duty and tradition, qualities that had served him well in his roles as landowner, Member of Parliament, and head of one of England's most prestigious families. "Edmund," the Duke said, gesturing toward a chair upholstered in rich burgundy leather, "please, sit down. We have matters of importance to discuss on this eve of your wedding." Edmund accepted the offered brandy and settled into the designated chair, though his posture remained tense despite the familiar comfort of the room's atmosphere. He had endured countless lectures from his father over the years, covering topics ranging from financial responsibility to social obligations, and he suspected that tonight's conversation would follow a similar pattern. "Tomorrow marks not merely your personal happiness," the Duke began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had commanded attention in the House of Lords for over 3 decades, but the culmination of careful planning that will benefit our family for generations to come. The alliance with the Pembertons represents exactly the sort of strategic thinking that has maintained our position in society. Edmund nodded appropriately, though inwardly he bristled at his father's characterization of his marriage as a business transaction rather than a union based on affection or compatibility. The Duke's approach to family matters had always been governed by considerations of advantage and influence rather than emotional connection, a perspective that had shaped Edmund's own understanding of his obligations even as it left him feeling increasingly alienated from his authentic desires. "The Earl of Ravenshire's commercial interests complement our own holdings perfectly," the Duke continued, warming to his favorite topic of strategic advantage. "His shipping connections will prove invaluable to our textile investments, while his banking relationships will provide access to capital for future expansion. Most importantly, Charlotte herself brings not only a substantial dowry but also the potential for producing heirs who will inherit the combined strengths of both family lines. The casual reference to Charlotte as a breathing prospect rather than a human being with her own hopes and dreams caused Edmund's grip on his brandy snifter to tighten, though he maintained his composed expression through years of practice in concealing his true reactions from his father's penetrating gaze. "I understand your perspective, father," Edmund replied carefully, "and I recognize the practical advantages of the match. Charlotte is undoubtedly an excellent choice from every conventional standpoint." The Duke's sharp eyes detected the subtle emphasis Edmund had placed on the word conventional, and his expression shifted to one of paternal concern mixed with warning. "I trust you are not harboring any romantic notions that might interfere with your judgment, Edmund. Such flights of fancy are acceptable in novels and poetry, but they have no place in the serious business of family advancement." The conversation continued for another quarter of an hour, with the Duke offering detailed advice about the financial arrangements that would take effect after the marriage, the social connections that Edmund would be expected to cultivate, and the responsibilities that would fall to him as Charlotte's husband. Yet despite his father's obvious satisfaction with the upcoming union, Edmund found himself increasingly convinced that he was about to make a terrible mistake that would cast a shadow over the remainder of his life. When the interview finally concluded and Edmund was dismissed to prepare for the evening's dinner party, he found himself walking slowly through the corridors of Blackthorne House with the measured pace of a condemned man approaching the gallows. The portraits of his ancestors that lined the walls seemed to watch him with expressions of aristocratic disapproval, as if they could sense his growing reluctance to fulfill the destiny that his birth had ordained for him. Meanwhile, at Ravenshire Manor, Charlotte was experiencing her own crisis of confidence as she submitted to her mother's final inspection before the evening's dinner party. Lady Margaret had chosen Charlotte's evening gown with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of her social planning, selecting a creation of pale blue silk that perfectly complemented the sapphire jewelry that Edmund had given Charlotte as an engagement gift. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear," Lady Margaret pronounced, stepping back to admire the overall effect of Charlotte's appearance. "Tomorrow you will be the most beautiful bride that London society has seen in years." Yet even as her mother spoke these complimentary words, Charlotte struggled with a growing sense of disconnection from the elaborate preparations that surrounded her. The young woman who stared back at her from the full-length mirror appeared every inch the perfect aristocratic bride, yet Charlotte felt as though she were looking at a stranger who had somehow taken possession of her reflection. The arrival of the Blackthorne family for dinner was announced by the sound of multiple carriages on the gravel drive, and Charlotte took her position in the drawing room to receive her future in-laws with the proper dignity that the occasion demanded. The Duke and Duchess of Westmere entered with the confident bearing of individuals who had never questioned their right to command attention and respect, while Charles Blackthorne and his wife represented the next generation of aristocratic privilege. Edmund appeared last, resplendent in evening dress that had been tailored to perfection by London's finest craftsmen. Yet despite his impeccable appearance, Charlotte detected something in his demeanor that struck her as different from his usual composed confidence. His smile, while perfectly appropriate, seemed to require more effort than usual, and his responses to the various pleasantries exchanged during the pre-dinner conversation lacked their customary spontaneity. The dinner itself proceeded according to the elaborate protocol that governed such occasions, with multiple courses served on china that had been in the Pemberton family for generations and wine selected from the Earl's extensive cellars. Conversation flowed smoothly among topics deemed suitable for mixed company, ranging from recent developments in Parliament to reviews of the latest theatrical productions in London's West End. Yet beneath the surface civility that characterized the gathering, Charlotte sensed undercurrents of tension that she could not entirely identify. Edmund's contributions to the conversation, while perfectly appropriate, seemed mechanical rather than engaged. The Duke's obvious satisfaction with the approaching marriage was matched by an equally obvious expectation that his son would fulfill his duty without question or hesitation. As the evening progressed and the ladies withdrew to the drawing room while the gentlemen remained behind for port and cigars, Charlotte found herself engaging in conversation with the Duchess of Westmere about topics that seemed utterly trivial given the magnitude of the step she was about to take. The discussion of fashion trends and social gossip felt increasingly surreal as Charlotte contemplated the reality that tomorrow would irrevocably alter the course of her entire existence. When the gentlemen rejoined the ladies for the final portion of the evening's entertainment, Charlotte observed Edmund with increasing attention, searching for some sign of the enthusiasm that she hoped a bridegroom should display on the eve of his wedding. Instead, she detected an almost imperceptible distance in his manner, as though he were participating in the evening's events from behind an invisible barrier that separated him from genuine engagement with the proceedings. The realization that Edmund might be experiencing doubts about their marriage equal to her own struck Charlotte with unexpected force. Throughout their courtship, she had assumed that he was satisfied with the arrangement that their families had orchestrated, even if he did not demonstrate the passionate attachment that romantic literature suggested should exist between lovers. The possibility that he, too, might be questioning the wisdom of their union opened up possibilities that were both exciting and terrifying in their implications. As the evening drew to a close and the Blackthorne family prepared to return to their London residence, Edmund approached Charlotte for the private farewell that custom permitted them. For a moment, they stood together in relative privacy while their families engaged in the final pleasantries that such occasions required. "Charlotte," Edmund said quietly, his voice carrying a note of urgency that surprised her, "I want you to know that whatever happens, I have the greatest respect for your character and your intelligence. You deserve nothing but happiness in whatever path your life may take." The strange formality of his words, combined with their somewhat ominous tone, caused Charlotte to study his face with new intensity. "Edmund, is everything quite all right? You seem somewhat distracted this evening." Edmund hesitated for a moment, and Charlotte thought she detected a flicker of something that might have been desperation in his eyes before he recovered his composure. "Merely the natural nervousness of any bridegroom, I assure you. Tomorrow will be a momentous day for both of us." Yet even as Edmund spoke these reassuring words, Charlotte sensed that he was concealing something of far greater significance than simple pre-wedding anxiety. The feeling that some crucial piece of information was being withheld from her grew stronger as she observed the strained interaction between Edmund and his father during their final farewells. As the Blackthorne carriages disappeared into the darkness beyond the gates of Ravenshire Manor, Charlotte remained at her chamber window long after the sound of wheels on gravel had faded into silence. The night air carried the scent of roses from the gardens below, where tomorrow's wedding celebration would take place among settings that had been transformed into a vision of romantic perfection. Yet despite the beauty of her surroundings and the magnitude of the honor that awaited her, Charlotte found herself consumed by questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Was marriage truly meant to feel like a carefully orchestrated performance rather than a celebration of genuine love? Was she being foolish to hope for something more substantial than mutual respect and social compatibility? And most troubling of all, what was she to make of the growing certainty that Edmund himself harbored serious doubts about the step they were about to take together? The first light of dawn crept through the tall windows of Edmund's chamber at Blackthorne House, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet that covered the polished oak floors. Edmund had spent most of the night in restless contemplation, alternating between periods of pacing before the fireplace and sitting motionless in the leather chair that had belonged to his grandfather. His wedding attire hung from the wardrobe like a silent accusation, the morning coat and silk waistcoat prepared with Thompson's characteristic attention to detail. At precisely 6 o'clock, Thompson appeared with the morning tea service, his experienced eye immediately detecting the signs of his master's sleepless night. The valet had served the Blackthorne family long enough to recognize the difference between ordinary pre-wedding nervousness and the profound agitation that seemed to possess Edmund on what should have been one of the happiest days of his life. "My lord," Thompson said quietly, setting the silver tea service on the mahogany table near the window, shall I begin preparations for your morning toilette, or would you prefer additional time for contemplation?" Edmund looked up from the letter he had been holding, the same correspondence from Rebecca Fairfax that had arrived 3 days earlier but which he had not yet found the courage to open. Her handwriting on the envelope seemed to mock him with its familiar elegance, reminding him of afternoon conversations beneath the oak trees of his father's country estate, where social conventions had temporarily fallen away to reveal possibilities that his current circumstances made impossible to pursue. "Thompson," Edmund said slowly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was entirely foreign to his usual commanding tone, "have you ever found yourself at a crossroads where every available path seemed to lead away from happiness?" The valet's expression remained carefully neutral, though decades of service had taught him to recognize the moments when his employers required not merely professional efficiency but something approaching human understanding. "I have observed, my lord, that the most difficult decisions often involve choosing between duty and desire, and that such choices tend to define the character of the individual who makes them." Edmund nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the wisdom in Thompson's carefully chosen words. The concept of duty had been drummed into him from earliest childhood, presented as the cornerstone of noble behavior and the foundation upon which civilized society rested. Yet this morning, duty felt less like a noble calling than a prison from which there might be no escape once the ceremony commenced. The sound of activity from other parts of the house reminded Edmund that the machinery of his wedding day was already in motion. Downstairs, the household staff would be preparing for the departure to Ravenshire Manor, while his groomsmen would be arriving within the hour to assist with the final preparations. The weight of expectation from so many individuals who had invested time and energy in this celebration seemed to press down upon him with increasing force. As Thompson began the elaborate process of preparing Edmund for his role as bridegroom, the two men worked together in relative silence, each understanding that this morning ritual carried greater significance than the countless similar scenes they had enacted over the years. The starched white shirt, the carefully knotted cravat, the perfectly fitted morning coat, each element of Edmund's attire seemed to transform him further into the role that society expected him to play. Meanwhile, at Ravenshire Manor, Charlotte was experiencing her own morning ordeal as her mother supervised the transformation that would convert Lady Charlotte Pemberton into the radiant bride that London society expected to see. The process had begun before sunrise, with Sarah and 2 additional ladies-maids working to arrange Charlotte's hair in the elaborate style that would support the family tiara and complement the intricate beadwork of her wedding gown. The gown itself was a masterpiece that had required months of planning and construction, crafted from silk that had been specially imported from France and adorned with pearls that had been harvested from the family's own oyster beds. The design followed the fashionable empire silhouette while incorporating elements that paid homage to centuries of Pemberton family tradition, creating a garment that was both contemporary and timeless in its elegance. Yet as Charlotte submitted to the ministrations of the dressmaker and her assistants, she found herself thinking not of the beauty of her appearance but of the conversation she had overheard the previous evening between her parents. Speaking in hushed tones in the Earl's study, they had discussed the financial arrangements that would take effect after her marriage, referring to her dowry and future inheritance with the same calculating precision they might have used to evaluate a business transaction. The realization that her marriage was viewed primarily as a commercial alliance rather than a romantic union struck Charlotte with renewed force as she stood before the full-length mirror that dominated her dressing room. The young woman reflected in the silvered glass appeared every inch the perfect aristocratic bride, yet Charlotte felt increasingly disconnected from the elaborate performance that was unfolding around her. "Charlotte, my dear, you look absolutely magnificent," Lady Margaret announced, stepping back to admire the overall effect of her daughter's bridal ensemble. "The photographer will arrive shortly to capture your portrait, and then we must proceed to the chapel for the final preparations before the guests begin to arrive." The mention of the photographer reminded Charlotte of another element of the day's proceedings that felt strangely performative rather than genuinely celebratory. Every aspect of the wedding had been carefully orchestrated to create the impression of perfect happiness and romantic fulfillment, yet Charlotte found herself wondering whether substance existed beneath the elaborate surface presentation. As the morning progressed and the time for the ceremony drew closer, both Charlotte and Edmund found themselves increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by well-meaning family members and friends. The elaborate preparations that consumed everyone else's attention served only to heighten their awareness of the gulf that separated their internal experience from the joyful celebration that was expected of them. Edmund's groomsmen arrived at Blackthorne House with the boisterous good humor that characterized young men of their class when gathered for celebratory occasions. Lord William Ashford, Edmund's closest friend since their days at Eton, brought news of last night's bachelor party at one of London's most exclusive gentlemen's clubs, where toasts had been raised to Edmund's future happiness and prosperity. "Edmund, old fellow," William announced with characteristic enthusiasm, "you're the picture of composed elegance this morning. I confess I half expected to find you in a state of nervous collapse, as is traditional for bridegrooms on their wedding day." Edmund managed to produce an appropriate smile in response to his friend's jovial commentary, though the effort required to maintain his facade of anticipatory happiness was becoming increasingly difficult. The well-meaning jokes and congratulations from his groomsmen served only to emphasize the disconnect between his internal turmoil and the joyful celebration that everyone else expected him to experience. At Ravenshire Manor, similar scenes were unfolding as Charlotte's bridesmaids gathered to assist with the final preparations and offer their congratulations on what they universally proclaimed to be the most romantic wedding of the social season. Lady Penelope Worthington, Charlotte's dearest friend since childhood, had travelled from her family's estate in Devonshire specifically to serve as maid of honour, bringing with her the latest gossip from London society and several amusing anecdotes about recent social events. "Charlotte, I must tell you how envious every unmarried lady in London will be when they see you today," Penelope said as she helped to arrange the trailing silk of Charlotte's veil. "Edmund Blackthorne is considered quite the catch, and your wedding is certain to be discussed in drawing rooms throughout the capital for months to come." Charlotte nodded and made appropriate responses to her friend's cheerful commentary, yet she found herself wondering whether the envy that Penelope predicted was based on genuine romantic fulfillment or merely on the social and financial advantages that the marriage would provide. The distinction had never seemed particularly important during her sheltered upbringing, yet this morning it felt like the difference between authentic happiness and elaborate self-deception. The arrival of the photographer marked another milestone in the day's carefully orchestrated proceedings, as Charlotte was positioned in various locations throughout Ravenshire Manor to create a visual record of her transformation from maiden to bride. The formal portraits, which would later be displayed in both family homes and distributed to relatives throughout England, captured the external perfection of the occasion while revealing nothing of the emotional complexity that lay beneath the surface. As the clock in the entrance hall struck 10, indicating that the wedding ceremony was now only 2 hours away, both Edmund and Charlotte found themselves facing the same crucial question that had haunted their thoughts throughout the sleepless night. Was it possible to proceed with a marriage that satisfied every practical consideration while leaving their hearts fundamentally unchanged, or was some more dramatic action required to preserve their authentic selves? The weight of family expectations, social obligations, and financial arrangements seemed to press down upon them with increasing force as the moment of final commitment approached. Yet beneath these practical considerations lay deeper questions about the nature of love, duty, and personal fulfillment that neither had been encouraged to examine during their carefully regulated courtship. For Edmund, the unopened letter from Rebecca Fairfax seemed to represent everything that his proper marriage to Charlotte would require him to abandon. For Charlotte, the growing certainty that Edmund harbored serious doubts about their union raised possibilities that were both terrifying and exhilarating in their potential implications. As servants throughout both households bustled about their final preparations and carriages began to arrive bearing the earliest guests, the protagonists of this elaborate drama found themselves standing at the threshold of a decision that would determine not merely their immediate future but the entire trajectory of their adult lives. The morning sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky above London, casting its light upon a city that remained blissfully unaware of the crisis of conscience that was unfolding in one of its most prestigious households. Within a few hours, society would gather to witness what appeared to be the perfect union of two noble families, yet the individuals at the center of this celebration were struggling with questions that had no place in the carefully regulated world of aristocratic marriage. Thompson made the final adjustments to Edmund's cravat while Charlotte's maid secured the last pearl buttons on her gloves, and both bride and groom prepared to assume their roles in a ceremony that would transform them forever, regardless of whether that transformation represented the fulfillment of their dreams or the beginning of a lifetime of regret. The sound of church bells in the distance announced that the hour of decision was rapidly approaching, and soon there would be no opportunity for further contemplation or reconsideration. The elaborate machinery of their wedding day had gained momentum that seemed impossible to stop, carrying them inexorably toward a moment that would define the remainder of their existence. The chapel at Ravenshire Manor had been transformed into a vision of ethereal beauty that would have impressed even the most sophisticated members of London society. White roses cascaded from every available surface, their delicate petals creating a carpet of ivory along the aisle that Charlotte would soon traverse as she made her way toward marriage with Edmund Blackthorne. Garlands of ivy wound around the ancient stone columns that supported the chapel's vaulted ceiling, while hundreds of cream-colored candles cast a warm, golden glow that seemed to make the very air shimmer with romantic possibility. The guests had begun arriving at precisely 11 o'clock, their elaborate carriages forming an impressive procession along the tree-lined drive that approached the manor. Representatives of England's most prestigious families emerged from their conveyances in a display of wealth and fashion that spoke to the significance of the alliance being celebrated. Duchesses in silk gowns that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime conversed easily with earls whose family history stretched back to the Norman conquest, while their attendants arranged themselves according to the complex hierarchy that governed every aspect of aristocratic social interaction. Lady Margaret Pemberton moved through the gathering with the practiced grace of an experienced hostess, ensuring that each guest felt appropriately welcomed while simultaneously supervising the countless details that required attention before the ceremony could commence. Her satisfaction with the successful execution of her carefully laid plans was evident in every gesture and expression, though she remained vigilant for any potential crisis that might threaten the perfection of her daughter's wedding day. The Earl of Ravenshire had positioned himself near the chapel entrance, where he could greet the most important guests personally while keeping a watchful eye on the proceedings. His conversation with the Duke of Westmere focused on the financial arrangements that would take effect after the marriage, and both men expressed satisfaction with the advantageous alliance that their children's union would create for both families. Yet despite the obvious success of the elaborate preparations and the impressive gathering of distinguished guests, several key individuals were notably absent from the celebration. Edmund Blackthorne had not yet arrived at Ravenshire Manor, though his groomsmen had been present for the past hour, assuring concerned family members that he was simply attending to some last-minute details at Blackthorne House. Charlotte remained secluded in her private chambers, ostensibly making final preparations but actually struggling with a crisis of conscience that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The elaborate wedding gown that had required months of planning and construction felt like an ornate prison that would soon trap her in a role she was increasingly certain she did not wish to play. Meanwhile, in his study at Blackthorne House, Edmund sat motionless before his writing desk, Rebecca Fairfax's letter finally opened before him. The contents had proven even more devastating than he had anticipated, for Rebecca had written to inform him of her family's departure from England. Her father had accepted a position managing an estate in Ireland, and they would be leaving within the week to begin their new life far from the social constraints that had made their attachment impossible. "My dearest Edmund," the letter began, "I hope this correspondence finds you in good health and happiness as your wedding day approaches. I wanted you to know that my family will be departing England soon, which will finally put an end to the impossible situation that has caused us both such pain. I wish you every joy in your marriage to Lady Charlotte, and I hope that time will allow you to find genuine happiness in the life that your birth and position have ordained for you." The letter continued for several paragraphs, expressing sentiments that managed to be both heartbreaking and liberating in their implications. Rebecca's words made clear that she had never expected their attachment to overcome the social barriers that separated them, yet she also revealed the depth of feeling that had made their relationship so significant despite its seeming impossibility. Most significantly, Rebecca's impending departure meant that Edmund's decision about his marriage to Charlotte was no longer complicated by the possibility of an alternative future with the woman who had captured his heart. If he chose to abandon his wedding and pursue Rebecca, he would be destroying his family's carefully laid plans for nothing more than a final conversation with someone who would soon be beyond his reach forever. Yet the realization that Rebecca would soon be gone served only to clarify Edmund's understanding of his own feelings rather than simplifying his decision. The prospect of marriage to Charlotte had become unbearable not because he hoped to win another woman, but because he had finally recognized the difference between a union based on practical considerations and one founded on genuine love and mutual understanding. As Thompson appeared in the doorway to announce that the carriage was ready for their departure to Ravenshire Manor, Edmund found himself faced with the most crucial decision of his life. He could proceed with the wedding that would satisfy every expectation placed upon him by family and society, or he could find the courage to acknowledge that such a marriage would be unfair to both himself and Charlotte, regardless of its practical advantages. "Thompson," Edmund said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality that surprised even himself, "I need you to deliver a message to Ravenshire Manor immediately. Tell them that Lord Edmund Blackthorne will not be attending his wedding today." The valet's expression remained carefully neutral despite the momentous nature of the instruction he had just received. Years of service had taught him that his role was to support his employer's decisions rather than question them, regardless of their potential consequences. "Very good, my lord," Thompson replied with characteristic dignity. "Shall I indicate when you might be expected to return, or provide any additional explanation for your absence?" Edmund rose from his desk and moved to the window that overlooked the garden, where the morning sun was approaching its zenith in a cloudless sky that seemed to mock the darkness of his decision. "Tell them only that urgent business has called me away from London, and that I will write to explain my actions as soon as circumstances permit." As Thompson departed to carry out his instructions, Edmund began the process of packing the few belongings he would need for an indefinite absence from London society. His destination remained unclear, but he knew with absolute certainty that he could not remain in England to face the consequences of his decision or the disappointed expectations of the families who had invested so much in his marriage to Charlotte. At Ravenshire Manor, the first signs of crisis appeared when Edmund's groomsmen began to express concern about his continued absence as the appointed hour for the ceremony approached. Lord William Ashford had been dispatched to Blackthorne House to investigate the delay, while the other members of the wedding party attempted to maintain their composure despite growing anxiety about the situation. Charlotte, who had been summoned to the chapel for final preparations, immediately sensed that something was seriously amiss from the nervous expressions and hushed conversations that surrounded her. When her mother approached with an expression of barely controlled panic, Charlotte felt her own carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. "Charlotte, my dear," Lady Margaret said, her voice strained despite her obvious efforts to remain calm, "there seems to be some delay with Edmund's arrival. I'm certain it's merely a matter of last-minute preparations, but we may need to postpone the ceremony by a few minutes." Yet even as her mother spoke these reassuring words, Charlotte detected the underlying fear that Lady Margaret was struggling to conceal. The elaborate celebration that had consumed months of planning was beginning to unravel, and the implications of Edmund's absence were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore or explain away. The arrival of Thompson with Edmund's message brought the crisis to its inevitable climax, as the gathered families were forced to confront the reality that their carefully orchestrated alliance had collapsed at the moment of its intended consummation. The Duke of Westmere's expression of cold fury reflected not merely personal disappointment but professional humiliation, while the Earl of Ravenshire struggled to comprehend how his business acumen had failed to anticipate such a dramatic reversal. For Charlotte, however, Edmund's decision to abandon their wedding brought not devastation but an unexpected sense of relief that surprised her with its intensity. The prospect of marriage to a man who clearly harbored serious doubts about their union had been troubling her for weeks, and his dramatic departure served to confirm her own growing certainty that their engagement had been based on practical considerations rather than genuine affection. As the news of Edmund's absence spread through the assembled guests, creating a buzz of shocked conversation and sympathetic murmurs, Charlotte found herself standing in the chapel that had been prepared for her wedding and experiencing something that felt remarkably like liberation. The elaborate gown that had seemed like a prison now felt merely like an expensive costume that she would soon be able to remove, while the social expectations that had governed her life began to lose their hold over her imagination. Lady Margaret's attempts to manage the crisis and preserve some semblance of dignity for the family proved admirable but ultimately futile, as the magnitude of the social embarrassment became impossible to conceal or minimize. The gathered guests would return to their London drawing rooms with a story that would entertain society for months to come, while both the Pemberton and Blackthorne families would be forced to endure the consequences of Edmund's dramatic decision. Yet as Charlotte stood amid the ruins of her wedding day, surrounded by the beautiful decorations that had been intended to celebrate her transformation into Mrs. Edmund Blackthorne, she found herself contemplating possibilities that had never been available to her during the carefully regulated months of her engagement. Edmund's decision to follow his authentic feelings rather than submit to social expectations had opened up questions about her own future that were both terrifying and exhilarating in their implications. The sound of carriages departing as disappointed guests began to leave Ravenshire Manor marked the end of what was to have been the social event of the season, but it also marked the beginning of something entirely unexpected for both Charlotte and Edmund. Their lives had been irrevocably altered by the morning's events, yet neither could say with certainty whether the change represented disaster or the first step toward authentic happiness. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Ravenshire Manor, where white roses still bloomed in testimony to the celebration that had never taken place, both protagonists of this failed romance found themselves free to contemplate futures that no longer followed the predetermined patterns that their births had seemed to ordain. The countryside of Derbyshire stretched endlessly beneath a canopy of spring clouds, its rolling hills dotted with sheep and crossed by stone walls that had stood for centuries. Edmund Blackthorne guided his horse along a familiar bridle path that wound through his family's northern estate, where he had spent the past 6 months in voluntary exile from London society. The scandal of his abandoned wedding had made his presence in the capital impossible, yet this enforced solitude had provided him with the first genuine peace he had experienced in years. The estate house where Edmund had taken refuge was far more modest than the grand mansions that had dominated his life in London, yet its simple elegance and connection to the natural world around it appealed to sensibilities that he had never been encouraged to develop during his aristocratic upbringing. Here, surrounded by tenant farmers and estate workers who cared nothing for the social conventions that had governed his previous existence, Edmund had begun to discover aspects of himself that years of formal education and social training had effectively suppressed. His correspondence with his family had been limited to the minimum necessary to handle business matters, though he knew that his father's fury over the abandoned wedding remained undiminished despite the passage of time. The Duke of Westmere had made it clear that Edmund's return to London society would be contingent upon his willingness to make amends for the embarrassment he had caused, yet Edmund found himself increasingly indifferent to the prospect of resuming his former life. The Morning Post had brought a letter that surprised Edmund with both its source and its contents. Charlotte Pemberton had written to him for the first time since his dramatic departure from their wedding, and her message revealed developments that he could never have anticipated during the dark months following his decision to abandon their marriage. "My dear Edmund," Charlotte's letter began, I hope this correspondence finds you in good health and that your time away from London has provided the peace of mind that you sought when you made your courageous decision to follow your authentic feelings rather than submit to social expectations. I wanted you to know that your choice, while initially shocking to our families and society, ultimately served to liberate both of us from a union that would have satisfied every practical consideration while leaving our hearts fundamentally unchanged. Edmund read these words with growing amazement, for they revealed a perspective on his actions that he had never dared to hope might exist. Throughout the months of his exile, he had tormented himself with guilt over the pain and embarrassment that his decision had caused Charlotte and their families, yet her letter suggested that his seemingly selfish choice had actually served interests beyond his own. Charlotte's letter continued to describe the months that had followed their aborted wedding, revealing a process of self-discovery that paralleled Edmund's own journey toward authentic understanding of his desires and capabilities. Rather than retreating into wounded isolation, Charlotte had used the scandal surrounding her abandoned engagement as an opportunity to question the assumptions that had governed her life and to explore possibilities that had never been presented to her during her carefully regulated upbringing. The weeks following our intended wedding were certainly difficult, Charlotte wrote, as our families struggled to manage the social consequences of your departure and I grappled with my own feelings about the collapse of our engagement. Yet as time passed, I began to recognize that your decision to follow your heart rather than submit to duty had freed me to examine my own desires more honestly than I had ever been able to do while bound by the expectations of others. The most surprising revelation in Charlotte's letter concerned her growing involvement in charitable work among London's poor, activities that would have been considered entirely inappropriate for a young lady of her station under normal circumstances. Yet the social disgrace that had followed Edmund's abandonment of their wedding had paradoxically provided Charlotte with a freedom of movement and purpose that her previous elevated position had never allowed. I have discovered, Charlotte continued, that the work of alleviating suffering among those less fortunate than ourselves provides a satisfaction that no amount of social prominence or material comfort could ever match. The children I teach to read in the charity schools care nothing for my family's wealth or social connections, yet they offer a genuine appreciation for my efforts that makes all the disapproval of fashionable society seem utterly insignificant by comparison. Edmund found himself smiling as he read Charlotte's descriptions of her charitable activities, recognizing in her words the same sense of authentic purpose that he had discovered in his own work managing the northern estate. Away from the artificial constraints of London society, both of them had apparently found opportunities to develop aspects of their characters that their aristocratic upbringing had never encouraged or even acknowledged. Charlotte's letter concluded with news that struck Edmund as even more remarkable than her transformation into a charitable reformer. She had apparently developed an attachment to Dr. James Harrison, a physician who devoted his practice to treating the poor and who shared her passion for social reform. Their courtship, conducted away from the scrutiny of fashionable society, had been based on genuine compatibility and shared values rather than the practical considerations that had governed her engagement to Edmund. Dr. Harrison and I plan to marry in the autumn, Charlotte wrote, in a simple ceremony that will reflect our mutual commitment to a life of service rather than social advancement. I wanted you to know of our engagement because I believe you will understand that this union represents everything that our own intended marriage lacked: genuine affection, shared purposes, and the prospect of authentic happiness built upon mutual respect and understanding. The letter concluded with Charlotte's expression of gratitude for Edmund's decision to abandon their wedding, a sentiment that seemed impossible yet which resonated deeply with his own growing understanding of the events that had transformed both their lives. Her courage in acknowledging that his seemingly cruel choice had actually served her best interests provided Edmund with a sense of redemption that he had never expected to experience. As Edmund folded Charlotte's letter and placed it carefully in his desk drawer alongside the other important correspondence he had received during his months of exile, he reflected on the strange turns that fate had taken since that morning when he had chosen authentic feeling over social obligation. His decision had been made in anguish and uncertainty, yet it had apparently served to free both Charlotte and himself from a future that would have satisfied every external expectation while leaving their deeper needs unmet. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Edmund's attention to the window, where he could see a carriage making its way up the winding drive toward the estate house. Visitors were rare at his retreat, and Edmund felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as he considered who might have traveled such a distance to reach his secluded refuge. To his amazement, the carriage bore the familiar crest of the Fairfax family, and his heart quickened as he recognized the figure who emerged from the vehicle. Rebecca Fairfax had returned to England, her family's situation in Ireland having apparently proved less permanent than originally anticipated. She appeared even more beautiful than Edmund's memory had suggested, though there was a new maturity in her bearing that spoke of experiences that had broadened her understanding of the world. As Edmund descended the front steps to greet Rebecca, he found himself experiencing a mixture of joy and uncertainty that reminded him of his younger self, before years of social training had taught him to suppress such spontaneous emotional responses. The months of separation had done nothing to diminish the attraction that had originally drawn them together, yet Edmund was keenly aware that his dramatic abandonment of his wedding to Charlotte had altered his social position in ways that might affect even this relationship. "Edmund," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the same warmth and intelligence that had captivated him during their earlier acquaintance, "I hope you will forgive my arriving without invitation, but I wanted to speak with you about the dramatic changes that have occurred in both our lives since we last met." As they walked together through the gardens that surrounded the estate house, Rebecca explained that her family's venture in Ireland had proved unsuccessful, forcing their return to England and her father's resumption of his position as estate manager. Yet the months of separation had provided her with perspective on their relationship that might never have been possible while they remained in daily contact. "Your decision to abandon your wedding to Lady Charlotte caused quite a sensation," Rebecca said, her tone carefully neutral despite the obvious significance of the topic. "Yet I believe I understand the courage that such a choice required, and I wanted you to know that your willingness to follow your authentic feelings rather than submit to social expectations has given me the strength to examine my own desires more honestly." The conversation that followed revealed that Rebecca's feelings for Edmund had remained constant despite the obstacles that their different social positions presented, yet she had also developed a clearer understanding of what such a relationship would require from both of them. Unlike his engagement to Charlotte, which had been based primarily on social and financial compatibility, a future with Rebecca would demand that Edmund choose love over convention in the most definitive possible way. "I will not pretend that our attachment could ever be easily accepted by your family or society," Rebecca said as they paused beside a stone fountain that reflected the afternoon sunlight in dancing patterns. "Yet I believe that genuine happiness is worth whatever sacrifices such acceptance might require." Edmund found himself studying Rebecca's face as she spoke, searching for any sign of the uncertainty or calculation that had characterized his relationship with Charlotte. Instead, he saw only the honest affection and intelligent understanding that had originally drawn him to her, combined with a maturity that suggested she had given serious consideration to the implications of their attachment. As the afternoon progressed and their conversation deepened, Edmund began to recognize that fate had provided him with an unexpected second chance to choose authentic feeling over social obligation. His exile from London society, which had initially seemed like a punishment for his abandonment of duty, had actually created the space necessary for him to discover what he truly valued in life. The decision that Edmund faced was in many ways more challenging than the choice he had confronted on his original wedding day, for this time he was fully aware of the consequences that his choice would entail. A future with Rebecca would mean permanent alienation from his family's world and acceptance of a social position far below what his birth had promised him. Yet as the sun began to set over the Derbyshire countryside, casting long shadows across the estate that had become his refuge, Edmund found himself contemplating a future that offered something far more valuable than social prominence or material advantage. The possibility of authentic love, genuine companionship, and a life built upon shared values rather than inherited obligations seemed to represent everything that his aristocratic upbringing had failed to provide. As Rebecca prepared to depart for her family's cottage, promising to return the following day to continue their conversation, Edmund stood watching her carriage disappear into the gathering twilight with a sense of anticipation that he had never experienced during his engagement to Charlotte. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in his adult life, Edmund felt that he was approaching a decision that would reflect his authentic self rather than the expectations that others had placed upon him. The letter from Charlotte that rested in his desk drawer served as a reminder that courage in following one's heart could lead to unexpected happiness, while Rebecca's return suggested that fate sometimes provided second chances to those brave enough to seize them. As Edmund prepared for what might prove to be the most important day of his life, he found himself finally understanding the difference between duty and authentic purpose, between social success and genuine fulfillment. The story that had begun with the apparent failure of an aristocratic wedding was transforming into something far more meaningful, a testament to the power of authentic feeling over social convention, and to the possibility that true happiness might be found by those courageous enough to abandon the paths that others had chosen for them in favor of journeys that led toward their authentic selves. The dawn that would soon break over the Derbyshire estate would illuminate not merely another day, but the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of individuals who had found the courage to choose love over convention, authentic purpose over inherited obligation, and the uncertain promise of genuine happiness over the hollow guarantees of social success.